travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Bird of Stars podcast, fifth season. It's going to be huge. Be sure to like and subscribe. Enjoy this amazing episode because Kieron Gillen boards the mothership to discuss Die Loaded from Image Comics. Now, come aboard as we're traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Gillen. Welcome back to the Bird of Stars podcast. Yeah, it's totally my pleasure. So we're talking about Die Loaded. The first series was absolutely fantastic. It came out 2018. So why did you decide to revisit the series and the universe?
Like when we originally made up Die, it was always kind of done as an ongoing thing, by which I mean ongoing, not as an ongoing comics, ongoing as it's just a device we can use to talk about role-playing games and fantasy and what it's for as long as we want. I mean, the thing I always compare it to is Phonogram. Like when we made up Phonogram, it was like, here's something I could use for the rest of my life to talk about what music does to people. So Die's kind of the same in that kind of like it's a broad, expansive thing we can tell multiple stories in. And we're at that tricky stage when you move from something which has been one specific story to here's a second story in the same kind of context. And in some ways, we made it easier for ourselves because I wrote the RPG between at the same time, and the
Yep.
RPG is all about showing, hey, other things can happen with Die. And so it's that kind of for me, it feels like a very well explored area, but it's not in comics anyway. So uh, we always plan to go back. In terms of the why now, it's kind of like we how to phrase this one. We finished Die, had a break. Did we call them giants? We always knew we were going to go back to Die. We just thought a slight break would be good, and we come back with this whole new thing. That's basically it. So yeah, we had also on the most basic fan level, we had so much other stuff in Die to talk about. You know what I mean? Like the character story was done, but Die's story wasn't. That sounded like a prepared quote, but no, it just sounds relatively put together.
Well, interestingly enough, when Die, the first series ended, it ended during COVID in 2020. Literally, the series ends with a reference to COVID and wearing the masks. The world has changed in the last few years, even more with, especially in the United States, with the rise of fascism.
Yeah, yeah.
How has
Not a
your
fan.
Yeah. So how has your thoughts, your ideas, your vision for the world of Die changed since you last visited the world?
We've got a push and pull between the situation where because Die, despite being a completely different story, as I've said, it is also a sequel. It's
Hmm.
kind of about the splash damage of the first story. It's the way that how trauma echoes out and how no one is an NPC. That's kind of one of the core ideas. And it's
Hmm.
about kind of digging into the reality of everyone outside of our own personal melodramas. Um, so the nature of that beast meant we've kind of had to pick up relatively close. So we pick up about a year after the end of Die. So it's 2021, 2022. So like we're still a little bit back in the timeline.
Hmm.
But in terms of me looking forward to where Die goes, I already know what I'm doing about the period we're in right now. Like if we when we reach that point, I already know the Die story I want to tell about that. But this is about something else. And just yeah, it's got some of the big world stuff in. Really, it's very personal. Like in the same way, Phonogram was also very personal. It's about the juxtaposition between music and my life. This is about the juxtaposition between fantasy and my life, and it's a lot about me being a new parent in the second one. You know, Ash returns at the end. Spoilers for everyone who hasn't read Die. Please read Die. Like Ash returns from Die to discover that a child happened when they're away. So this is kind of like Ash is a new parent, Sophie, the partner, wife, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of that in there as well, and other stuff. You know, it's about aging and death. It always is.
Well, the first series, you had the Grandmaster, you had Soul take over. The series ended with Chuck seemingly the next in line. How does that now play into the larger story?
It's a good question. I mean, like, I was sort of like, I would say that Chuck kind of at the end of Die was a more positive beat than the Grandmaster. The idea, oh no, I'm going to go and try to do some good for a while. So if
Hmm.
we return to Die, the question, of course, is what actually did happen to Chuck? Because that's a pretty optimistic view of how it would turn out. Because the thing
Yeah.
we do know about Fallen is they decay. So it doesn't, you know, like so what if we return to Die, what's happening with Chuck is interesting. But what's I think more interesting um is when we pick up this in the first issue, and that's kind of in the previews, so I don't mind saying it. It's like Chuck's body turned up in the real world.
Yeah.
So in other words, we have like Chuck who has multiple wives, ex-wives. You know, he's got two previous failed marriages. He's got a present marriage with a kid. He's got multiple kids in the real world. So there's a lot of fallout of various lives of people who he has hurt at various points, and he's abandoned them again. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like that's the meaty part of Die for me. It's like the in-world stuff is really interesting and obviously hugely important, but the juxtaposition between the mundane, real life people and what happens to them in the fantasy world and how it feeds back and forth.
Mm.
That's because so it's the weird tragedy of Chuck is that he went good by the end. He kind
Yeah.
of he learned from Die. It taught him stuff, and no one in his real life ever got any credit of that, any bonus. I remember like when I split with a partner of mine, one of the last things they ever said to me was like they just the annoyance they have as like I did so much work on you, and the next person is going to get the benefit. You know, like, and I felt that for her. At the same time, in credit, I think I did with her as well. Let's not, but that's life is learning. You either learn or you don't.
Mm.
With that's tautology, but also true. Anyway, I'm not
Well,
sure even what the question was there, but
well, the
yes,
interesting
all
thing
that. But yes, we are very much picking up all the characters' arcs from where we left off before and building in different directions, which are probably unexpected ones.
well, the irony for Chuck is that his character, or at least in-game character, is the Fool. Now the Fool has a chance of actual power and authority. Is that a good idea? Should the Fool that exists on some level of chaos be someone who has control?
Yeah, it's tricky. Like especially in the way Die works, is that they have these power sets. It's all about power sets, and they're kind of their often ironic commentary. Not even ironic commentary. They're ways to discuss their fundamental flaws. And Chuck is because he's carefree. He doesn't care enough. Ironically, his power comes from that. Not giving a damn is Chuck's thing, and it's how can you square that? That's interesting, and that's kind of true of them all in different ways. I don't want to. I could go down the list of the characters in Die and explain them. And it's because part of like when people play the role playing game, they sort of realize that oh no, you can apply these different archetypes and different relationships with power and temptation to different people with very different drives, and that's also in Die Loaded. It's kind of like I said the. To go back to Phonogram, one of the things in that very early story was going from Rue Britannia, our first story, to Singles Club, the second one. That was one of the biggest leaps in the series. In the first one was such a specific story. The second one was specifically designed to show what else the story is. As in, this is the other ways of looking at music and magic. And in some ways, Die Loaded as that. Here is like a very different selection of energies to show different angles of the work. And of course, on the most basic level, we haven't explored half of Die.
Yeah.
Like there's 20 regions. We haven't shown them all. And we're going to, we go through quite a few of the regions, is all I'm going to say. I'm not even sure, like, because obviously, like, this first structure, the first 12 takes it's like a full movement of the first 12 issues. I'm not 100% sure what all the regions we do in the second one. So I'm not sure we're going to hit them all. In fact, I know we're not going to hit one. But that's fun as well. That's the thing about Die. And this is what I think, one reason I'm quite excited about the sequel. The first one is so much work in that, and it's about these really complicated personal stories. It's also about this specific politics and world building of Die, and it's also about the entire history of the RPG in the structure of a fantasy story. Like, at least one of them, the history of Die, we don't have to do any more with. We've established that we've got Die, the amoral god out. The larger level world building we don't need to touch. And so now we've got the character stories, and the character stories are basically real world trauma thrown into a fantasy environment, and the fantasy environment throws the trauma back at them.
Mm.
That's the core driver of that. And the other driver is um, kind of the meta commentary of each region of Die, or the world itself of Die is talking about RPGs. So we've got that kind of bit, which is very planetary esque, and you've got the personal story, which is kind of Die's unique. No, unique's a strong word, but classic fantasy driver. And we're only doing two things instead of three things. So this feels, for me anyway, a more concentrated, directed story than Die. We get to give both those things more attention, and I have it hopefully for the better.
Well, I think one line that I found was very fascinating in issue 20. I'm going to read the line real quick. In issue 20 of the previous series, you write role-playing games or conversations. And I would argue so are stories of conversation between the author and the reader. What kind of conversation are you looking to have with your readers in the second series of Die?
Like, it's a really good question. I try to write fiction which is complicated enough for people to bring their own kind of stuff to it. I think that's like for me really important. In that kind of like I don't say this is how it should be. I kind of try to create characters with a level of trying to phrase this room for interpretation because drama isn't meant to be like a moralistic tale. It's not, it's not like we're not like kids watching He-Man with the thing at the end telling us how it's meant to be. that's kind of what I want to create a space for people's imagination to explore. Because that's at least one of the things that fantasy does. In that, RPGs are conversations with each other. And I'm kind of saying these are ways people are, how do they reflect your life? What does this mean to you? How much do you recognize? How much do you dread? So yeah, that's kind of what it is. I know that sounds kind of like quite arty. Not even arty, just kind of vague. Um, but I think that's the liminal nature of art is about that. It's a kind of a space where we find ourselves and the conversation. I tell you, like, this is sort of a side point, but like, I'm aware I probably think about criticism more than most. I mean, I used to be a critic, but I'm that kind of the idea of so much is me screaming into the void, the work,
Hmm.
as in, and so I kind of like the echo coming back, and it doesn't have to be anything to do with me, and I know it's not about me in any real way, but the idea that there is a fundamental not loneliness. I mean, like solo, just eventually I'm going to do solo RPGs, and it's one of those. But like, there is something wonderful in both comic books or fiction generally. If you alone with an author,
Hmm.
or RPGs, you alone with friends, and this thing comes between you. So yeah, I mean, like it's one of the things like you read a. I can read like a translation of sorry, Aristotle or whoever. I'm reading Poetics, and Aristotle is speaking to me, and he's been like over dead for more than 2,000 years.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It's a hell of a thing writing.
Now, when we think about this conversation that you're having, do you view this as a new conversation or unfinished conversation from the last series?
To be continued. It's like I viewed the die. It says book one on the side. I think if it should feel like book one, as in that here's a complete story, and that stuff is floating into space. The areas I continue is some of them, and the second one is here's a second aesthetic object that hopefully has coherence by itself.
Hmm.
And it's like, especially the first issue, we do quite a lot to, in terms of questions people will have about the end of the first one, we try to answer quite a few of them. That kind of like immediately. So you don't have to worry about this stuff. We're going to tell you the stuff you need to know, and then we're going to carry on building again.
Hmm. Now, another quote that I'm going to borrow from your previous series, because there's so many quotable lines in it, so I'm going to quote
Thank
another
you.
one of yours if you don't mind. You wrote, "Dice are always amoral gods." Now, you're talking about dice as as chance because it's random, it just happens, but you're also talking about the land itself of die. Can you explain how that connects to the nature of the world of die as well?
As one of the things about the way I conceive Die is, I mean, Tolkien's Middle Earth is a world as created by a linguist. Uh, Glorantha, Greg Stafford's world of RuneQuest, which is a classic RPG, is a world created by a theologian. It's not a theologian, a kind of I forgot what Greg's thing was, but basically someone who studies gods. That's his kind of thing. It's a spirit. It's a very much a sort of spiritualist structure. Dye's world is created by a critic. Like Dye is like a living argument about what I think RPGs consist of. I break out the individual parts of RPG, both in terms of their components and history, and put them in individual regions, and use that to explore them. So like you go to the front in Die 3 and you experience Tolkien and the history of the RPG via Tolkien's war experiences influencing his actual writing. But also it's about the critical push pull between it. So like those individual regions are like at war with each other because they are contrasting ideas of what the RPG is and the fight over, is RPG's mechanics, is RPG story, or is it the battlefront between the two? And that is even that what I've just said is a simplification. But that kind of living argument is very important.
Hmm.
So that's what Die is, I think. And I think that's where, I mean, Die saw an element of it. I mean, there's kind of like, the other way of looking at it, of course, is we just got, what's the particular phrase? Um, we're playing with the totemic elements of role-playing games. And then there's elements of like Die, which is, here is a satanic panic, which was in the 80s, D&D and RPGs were generally feared. We've won that battle. D&D is very much comfortable now in a position of cultural power. We Die kind of goes back and takes the stuff that basically was used to torment me when I was younger and say, okay, let's play with it. Let's
Yep.
reclaim those words. Maybe it is satanic. Maybe it is evil. Let's pretend it's evil and going to kill us all. And then we can play a game with it. And then the concept of magic circles in RPGs as well. So by taking things that we're afraid of, as in that history of RPGs, and putting it inside the magic circle of fiction, what I mean? There's magic circles all the way down. Yeah, I find all that stuff interesting. And I've also forgot the question again.
Well, we're talking about the amoral
Oh yeah.
aspect of
Um,
both the die themselves as random chance, and the world of die itself.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a component to it all. I mean, that's kind of what I meant. And it's one of the things about Ash is Ash kind of like as a narrator, she sort of meanders. Like she thinks of ideas and plays with it and looks at the metaphor and picks it up. And dice are interesting. I mean, like if you look at the history of dice, how they've been used culturally, that's really it. Because it's on some level, it's like when like modern Eurogamers have trouble understanding the chance of randomness, is that they're failing to understand the worldview that understood that life was random. You might just die of a random append. Oh,
Hmm.
any point like 100 years ago, I'd be dead at the age of 24 due to my appendicitis. I'm pretty sure that would have killed me. You
Hmm.
know, and like you probably wouldn't be. Many people, child death was so ridiculous, and all these kind of things. The concept of life being fundamentally random and unfair is not something I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast may necessarily be aware of, or
Hmm.
even if they're aware of, they're not really aware of in the way that somebody who lost six kids in childbirth or lost six kids, beneath five is. God, that's a depressing series of sentences. And that's where dice are. And I roll badly. Yes, that's life.
Yeah.
And that's where dice are God. They're amoral. And the idea there's a universe that they are these weird neutral judge we prostrate ourselves before. We just hope the dice don't turn up bad. I mean, that's what Matt's whole story was about in terms
Yeah.
of like numbers. Matt was like, all the players kind of had different sort of archetypes in terms of what they were exploring in terms of the bit, and Matt was numbers, just the pure, you know. He lost his mum to a very small chance, and just because it's very small doesn't mean it's not there.
Hmm.
And that's card. I mean, it's one of those things, perversities of like D&D is so weird. The idea of you have a 1 in 20 chance of like completely messing up in a way that gets you murdered, and it's like, no, that is not something any sane society or any reasonable society should be based around. Anyway, dice amoral. They crush us.
So we think of die the world the first series. Do you think the outcome wasn't is unfair, or did each character get the outcome they deserve?
I think I think one of the things like it's the difference between like die as the character. Dice are of course random, but die as a character is amoral. There's a kind of just a fundamental disconnectness to there. And there's quite a lot of us in the second series because since we don't know what die does,
Hmm.
it's trying to discover who we are. That's kind of what die does, and it's in the same way that a scientist may play with rats. That's what die is. In that kind of in the same way a GM may set up a scenario and play to find out. Play to find out is one of those kind of the cruelest statements, isn't that kind of yeah? We're going to put you in a room full of minotaurs. Let's play to find out what happens. But I still put you in a room full of minotaurs.
Right.
Um, there's a lot of die. You know what I mean? Like die is just the cruel. Just the Stanford prison experiment was pretty amoral. That's die. That's the amorality of die. I think. I said, yeah, that sounds like an interesting experiment. Is it ethical? I have no interest in that.
Well, for those who might not know the Stanford prison experience, because it's an interesting experiment when in regards to talk about die as well. You took a bunch of regular people who, on their own life, were going to be regular people, live their lives, never commit anything heinous, stuck them in a prison situation, and realized that the guards did end up turning abusive to their prisoners. Some reason that now that you brought that up sounds like an interesting analogy for what die could be, what die could
Yeah.
be like, in which is was Die a product of those people who entered the world, and are the people who entered Die, like Matt and Ash and those, forced into situations of immorality because of being in the situation of Die, or into the world of Die?
I think that's there's so much stuff built into the class, especially in the first series. There's a moment where those six cat people get together and make up the six iconic characters of Die, and everyone else who goes to the Die is kind of fitting that structure.
Yeah.
So they are Soul, especially Soul, is a demiurge to Die, as in Soul specifically creates the specifics of Die that people is then used. As we kind of join him in the second series, he's been working on the game since as well. So like he hasn't stopped because that's Soul for you. Uh, um, all that's true, but at the same time, like Die is a pre-existing thing. We kind of get deep into Die's cosmology here, but like Die is a, a thing outside us. And he maybe used it us in lots of different ways, but it is a thing that just predates upon imagination. It you can imagine it floating in the void until we're somebody dreams of a better world, and then it's got us. There's a bit in the RPG where we literally I write stats for Die in a kind of two-page background, and his stats are basically whatever. Um, but it's that kind of like as long as it's like some if you're optimistic, Die will continue to exist as long as anybody plays a role-playing game ever. And if you're more pessimistic, Die will continue to exist as long as anybody dreams of a world other than that which they are in.
Well,
And that's Die.
well, Isabel brings up an interesting question the first day, where she says she wants to treat those who exist within Die as real people and be responsible for them as if they exist. Do they exist in any way that we understand existence? The people
Good
that
question.
die.
That's the sort of thing that I don't think I would be comfortable answering. It's like there's definitely some of the characters because I think that the variable reality of the dire people, or at least how to phrase this, the relative complexity of some of the people in Die. There was a really one of my favourite arcs with Chuck and the Two Dwarfs, Dour and Delighted. That's some of my favourite stuff in Die. As in, they are two-note characters. This one's sad, this one's happy. That's it. Uh, um, but you get some stuff by because this is one of the you go back to the concept of cartooning, as in cartooning is increasing meaning via less lines, as it's not a photograph. You so yeah, these are less quote unquote realistic people. In fact, they're trapped by the fact that they're one emotion each, but they're still treated like people. The story
Hmm.
doesn't like treat them as just like phantasms. Um, yeah, it's not something I'm comfortable in answering.
I,
Um, I think yeah, I'm really like I would not like to say anything in case it gets taken out of context because I think the lands of imagination are a complicated place.
hmm. Now, also looking at the second series, I know we talked about Ash returning. Does Matt the Grief Knight also return in the second series as a primary character?
Uh, it's one of those where like I don't really want to talk about specifically like primary characters is a question. All the characters are in it, and the story is about the impact of them being away and all the fallout in everybody's lives. So it's one of the bits where like different characters have different levels of spotlight. Um, and it's usually for a very unusual filter. It's about them, but it's not about them in the same way. And that's a very unsatisfying answer, I know. But yeah, by the end of the first issue, you'll realize what I'm doing. Like when me and Stephanie got together and realized, oh, right, I see what this does. And also, hopefully, people get, oh no, whilst it's quite different, I think they'll also get why it's also the same,
Hmm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, I just find like the Grief Knight is such a fascinating character because when you think about the character, to be so having to be perpetually sad to have your power source,
Mm.
the amount of trauma that can cause an individual, that must be permanently changing of how you see the world, how you view sadness. And you would wonder too, at least I'm wondering as I'm reading the story, as I got to reread the story, is at some point does perpetual sadness lead to apathy?
Yeah, I mean, like the interesting thing for me about Matt is. I mean, to also Angela went the other way actually, but Matt, like, he had his big trauma before he went to die. Like everyone else, die was the trauma. Matt had lost his mum unexpectedly at an early age, and then he disappeared for 2 years. And like, at least on some level, you can see the grief knight as the idea of his power fantasy. The idea this grief has to mean something. Maybe that's what the grief. And so yeah, and it by the time he comes back to die, it becomes a much more different thing, because it's like that's what he doesn't want to be anymore.
Mm.
And like his entire life, Matt's life is he got married young, happily. He's got kids. He's a very happy family man. And the weird sort of standards of Matt is that, and now his kids are leaving home. So now what? And that sword still there? I say that, you know what I mean? Like it's the black dog of depression in the form of a murderous death weapon. So yeah, that's kind of what Matt's story is about. Angela was the other way. Angela was like kind of a refusal to feel grief and then get into increasingly self-destructive behaviors.
Mm.
So that like and she had a similar. She also got married young, but she's kind of not had a successful marriage. Um, Her kids hate her. And it's one of the things like yeah. So that if we go back to earlier, like I sort of talking about the character work, there's so much about the dovetailing of people's lives and how they both respond in different ways to trauma.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Well, I think another thing I mean, the first series was incredible. It's also, for those who may or may not know, a three-time Hugo Award nominated series. So, I mean, no pressure. But I mean, is there a certain is there pressure in knowing that the first series was viewed in a very high elevated light because once again, being nominated, very well received, to now everything you have to do now has to equal that. It's sort of like going back to the world of fantasy. It's like you're Peter Jackson, you meet Lord of the Rings, and now you're trying to make the Hobbit movies.
Yeah.
It's a rough it's a rough thing to try to match.
I tell you, the Die equivalent of remaking the Hobbit movies would be of course, the weird thing about Die is we never show what happened when they went first time to die. If I
Right.
actually just did the prequel, that would be the straight Hobbit one, and I think
Yeah.
that would probably be a bad idea. I say that it's like maybe it would. For me, it's like the what happened back then is the interesting thing,
Yeah.
as in specifically not breaking it down. But I wake up tomorrow and go, no, I actually understand exactly what I want to do.
Yeah.
Um, that I can see. It's one of these bits where you get if you're playing a role playing game and you're GM and you're doing a whole story with the players and they finish the scenario and they think they finished the scenario when the other person behind the GM screen is like, oh no, I've got this rest of this other stuff planned. That's how I feel. So I don't really think about Die as a sequel. You know what I mean? It is, but like I view it as in the same way Phonogram was an extension of the work, and in
Mm.
some ways Die. I keep comparing it to Phonogram. Like you'd think I'd compare it to Wick Div or What's the Future, one of the other books. Like Phonogram isn't my most successful book, but it's probably my most personal book about, with the possible exception of Die. So I keep on coming back to that. And Die in some degree is art for art's sake. Die is I mean, I had no idea it was going to sell as well as it did. I was very lucky that I hit an RPG wave, and the industry was kind of ready for an RPG comic that was a bit quasi-intellectual. Let's you know what I mean? Like most RPG comics tend to be quite light and playful in a good way. I don't do mean that insultingly, but Die was like, oh no, we're going to take it all worryingly seriously, and it's a funny book, but we're going to take it very, very seriously.
Mm.
So like, it comes from that part of my mind. I don't worry about really what people make of it too much because it's me personally wrestling with my demons and killing them for experience points.
Well, the
I
other
like
nice
that
thing,
metaphor.
well, the other nice thing I enjoy about Die, and as an English teacher, I appreciated was that the references to the famous authors. You have H.P. Lovecraft being mentioned, Charlotte Bronte, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, others who may appear in the new series. Are there some famous writers that we're thinking of that may pop up in Die Loaded?
There is like the thing that the way to people listening who don't know the cosmology of Die, there's 20 regions of Die, and each one is ruled by a master. Ruled is the wrong word. It's kind of like the guardian or custodian. Some of
Hmm.
them actually do rule, but other ones are just kind of like keepers of the place. They keep the vague area. Think about Radagast and Mirkwood. That's a pretty good comparison. And each one is about a specific bit of what that region is about. Now, I concentrate on the literary forebears of RPGs, and like the mechanical forebears, like the two German generals who are very into Kriegspiel. Actually, I'm like one German general. Uh, I'll, I'll go back and check. Father and son, both they're kind of mechanical forebears of what RPGs begin. I never actually showed them on panel, even though I referenced them quite a few times. This one, I'm concentrating on the ones I haven't touched before. Like there's a little bit of, and I almost don't want to name them because it's kind of the joy when they turn up. But like, there's at least one literary issue in the first six issues. There's one non-literary issue because I thought it was quite. The fact we concentrate so much on the literary made me kind of aware of. I think there's people we haven't touched on who are just as important to RPGs, especially and it's especially in a comic. We should probably cover it as well. So we hit that in issue two. So that's something you will hit in a very different way.
Well, one of the writers that had a significant part in the original Die is H.P. Lovecraft, who's had created he said one of the first authors who really created that unified universe theory, not theory, but unified universe, interlocking universe of stories. Everything kind of exists in the same world, sort of like what, well, not quite like King. King had more like a multiverse thing, but one of the earlier ideas of multiverse. But he also is a very complex figure historically. Is
Mm.
that a particular reason why you chose him too, for the complexity of how he's viewed both as this genius writer, but also as a troubled individual? At least going back 100 years of cultural change.
I think that there's always like multiple things going on. Like, and I hate giving answers to that sort of question for the simple reason that they are multifaceted. And like, if I give an answer, someone on Reddit will say, "Kieron said this," and just usually half remember it and say it wrong, which is incredibly frustrating. But the the main reason I hit Lovecraft, and actually the other reason I should say before going is I have the idea of what I'm going to use them for, and then I go and do the research for the issue, and they normally use them for something else. Because I've discovered in the process. I mean, H.G. Wells I also used, and I was pretty sure I was going to make H.G. Wells a hero because I'd treated H.G. Wells had been a kind of semi-villainous figure in Wicked Divine, but I did the research and it was like actually no, the interesting story is him being an arrogant person who is in over his head because H.G. Wells' arrogance was really interesting, and especially when you got the time machine and time is yada 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 yada. With Lovecraft, the original, very core thing was I just thought it. I'm pretty sure I thought it was funny, but the idea that H.G. Wells being inspired by people playing Call of Cthulhu in the future and mistaking the kind of like awful, pallid, inbred, horrific creatures to be 1980s gamers, I think I just thought that was funny,
Mm.
and you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot more to it than that. So that's probably the core thing. I think the other thing is that the story is a cosmic horror story. The idea of Die is basically manipulating the stuff in the past to create the thing in the future. Die is kind of elder goddy in that energy. So in some ways, H.G. Wells is also the genre nod in terms of we're in a, we are, this is the genre of story you are reading. Let us do that story.
Yeah.
So they're probably the two reasons. And he was, as you say, early, early larger continuity stuff, but really also early fandom. Like around HG, there's less of that in the story because I ended up going the direction I did. But H.G. Wells' involvement in early fandom is quite an interesting aspect because how fandom develops alongside RPG. Sorry, how fandom developed and
Mm.
eventually became RPG fandom is interesting. I mean, I compare. You mentioned the Hugos, which obviously are incredibly complimenting, but obviously the community that became the Hugos, H.G. Wells was part of that community. There's a lineage there. Tolkien, no, Tolkien's an outsider art doing his own thing. He had to be dragged to one Worldcon. Is that right? I looked this up recently, but I think he attended once one of these things to receive something, and it clearly isn't his jam, Daddy-O. And so Tolkien is, it's not Tolkien, sorry. Lovecraft in some ways a more direct forebear to what happened in 1970s in America of D&D.
Mm.
That I think is the main reasons.
Well, like I said, I've always been a fan of Lovecraft. Luckily, I live in Rhode Island, so
Ah,
where Lovecraft lived, and I got to visit not only his burial, but the observatory where he did much of his work. So he's very much in the world of Rhode Island, a very real, still a real individual in many ways. People still apparently leave copies of his book in front of his tomb, which is fantastic,
that's cool.
because he's a great writer. So for the original book, you also created a tabletop RPG game for it. Are we creating a new one for the new series, or?
Don't make me do it again. No, no. Basically, I kind of it's the weird thing about dies. I view them as the same thing. Like it's like there's definitely a period when I wasn't sure which was the tail and which was the dog, because the ideas bounced back and forth between them, and eventually, kind of the dog ate its own tail and became an Ouroboros in time and space. And I kind of view the RPG and the comic as different ways of looking at the same thing. As in it's like a hologram. You look at different directions and get a more detailed picture. Um, like specifically in the RPG, every single RPG game is part of Die canon. That's kind of part of built into its structure for reasons which will be explained if you read the comic and game, in fact. Um, what we're doing is we're actually doing a little bit of beta material in the back of the comic. So, like after issue one, which issue one was just filled the comic, but issue two and onwards, I'm just writing beta stuff. The backbone, I think, is going to be the specific rules for the 12 gods. Also, that the character profiles of the gods. So, even if you don't play the game, it's quite fun to read, I don't know, 500 words about the bear or whoever else. So, that's the backbone. There's a few other things I want to do in there. So, yeah, basically, I'm using the back matter in part as a scratch pad to try some die ideas out. Also, I'm chatting with RRD, or Rowan Rook and Deckard, who are Die RPG's publisher, about stuff for next year we're thinking about. And of course, also there's the Die RPG Quick Start. We're coming out for Image. We did it already in a kind of RPG format, but we're doing it in a comic format, 56 pages, $7 in a available through Image and your comic shop. It's basically a sit down, start playing Die game. So it's got all the basic rules. It's got character sheets. It's got an entirely unique scenario for the Quick Start. So it's a really good way to sort of try the game and see what you feel, what it feels like. Yeah. So I'm definitely kind of into the idea since the RPG came out after the comic did. In some ways, people who've only just been reading the comic may not even be aware of the RPG anymore. So in some ways, the RPG is still the new thing.
What I'll do, I'll put a link into the RPG game in the show notes so people can find it easy, so we can support it. So for the second series, first series lasted 20 issues. What are we looking at for the second series?
So I suppose like the first series, we always said just ongoing and played it straight. Whilst it was very clear from the issue there was going to be 20 issues. Every issue had basically a promise it would be 20 issues on. And we always had the out though, in that kind of if we need more issues, we'll make the numbering go off the edge of the symbol because that's funny. That's breaking the cut. That A, it's funny. B, it's also being a little bit meta playful. So I know roughly how long this will be, and there's a couple of options. I think that's the best way of putting it. Like the first motion is 12 issues. In that kind of like there's a structure that will take place and then we'll see where it goes. Because it's one of the bits where we have a little bit more flexibility now. Like Dio always had to be 20 issues. This has, well, we can do this or this. And they both don't really change anything. It's just a question of whether we do it now or later, I guess.
Well, I mean, you could use a 100-sided die. I mean, is there room for 100 issues?
Oh, don't break me. I tell you, actually, I've got a lot. I do genuinely have an ongoing structure to about issue 60 or so in terms of what I would be doing.
Yeah.
And people probably spot the structure at some point during this series. Probably the
So,
back. Actually, if we hit issue 13, you'll spot the structure.
so what can you tease about the second series?
Like it's big, and I tell you what, I said earlier on the kind of the character driven part of it, as in this really drills down the characters more, and it's the theme of Die Loaded is manifold, but one of them is the first series is kind of about getting to know people you knew better via a game. So in other words, you knew each other, but the game allowed you to discover yourself and each other. And this is kind of the opposite. It's kind of getting to know people you don't know as well. It's like saying playing with strangers, playing with people who your first experience of them is via the mediated approach of the game.
Hmm.
And like this echoes all the way through. It's about on the personal level because it's about people meeting people. We said earlier about the concept of conversation, that the first conversation, but it's also on the higher level, like what is an RPG for? And we talk about cons. There's a lot about con culture built into Die Loaded, and like the underlying theme, which I think I said earlier. So no one's an NPC. There's a lot about that in terms of like protagonism, the idea of like who is actually matters, and that's kind of a bit about Dias. In terms of a bit more fun stuff, like issue 2 is a whole new region, big, dramatic, different, very different kind of master. Issue 3 is like gothic horror, kind of awful evil Mary Poppins stuff. 4 is like funny, like we talked. 4 is actually a funny one. It's kind of an isekai kind of thing, with its tongue broadly in its cheek. 5 is a literary one, which is ends up being much more bleak than I was expecting. Some real kind of like emotional messiness in there. And 6 is just really quite sad.
Oh.
But then the second arc is a bit more like this, and then the second arc is a bit more rollicking adventure, whilst really kind of having an emotions on its sleeve. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Well, I mean, the first series was fantastic. The not only the story, but the idea and the art. We didn't go talk about the art much, but it's
Oh God,
beautiful.
yeah.
The art and the colors are absolutely gorgeous. I look forward to reading the second issue on it comes out the first issue of the new series. It comes out November 12th. Mr. Gillen, it's an absolute honor to have you on my show again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And you say honestly, one of the main things about doing Diary is a fantasy world created by Stephanie Hans. Like that, the world needs that, and the world still needs that. Anyway, thanks
Hmm.
so much.